I made this drill press vise a few years ago, and I've used it on many projects since then, but I never did make a build video showing how I did it. Normally I do a lot of planning before I get started on a project, but I thought I would do this one much like I did the original, designing as I go and dealing with the problems as they crop up. One thing I liked about the original was the size of it. That seemed to be just about perfect, except it was taller, I think, than it needs to be. So I want to make the new one a bit lower profile, and while doing that, eliminate some of the parts to make it less complex. What I'm doing here is I'm cutting a shallow rabbet in each piece of the base, and what these do is guide the moving jaw as it goes back and forth. Now I'm back to the cabinet for more scrap plywood to make a part that interlocks with those rabbets, and that'll be fastened to the moving jaw. So after cutting it to the right width, I bring it over to the miter saw and cut it to the right length. But that turns out to be a little bit of a mistake. I should have left it long for a part that I need later in the build. Like I said, this part interlocks with the rabbets on the base, and this has to fit precisely, so I decided to make a sample as well to make some test cuts before I cut the real part. Okay, it fits good in the interlock, but the second scrap of plywood that I took down is thicker than the one that I already had, so I need to cut a little bit off, and I'm going to do part of the way, at least, on the table saw, and then clamp it in my vise and cut the rest of it away with a sharp chisel. What I'm cutting out here are the jaws. I need 3 of those. And I've got a stop block set up on my miter saw to cut them all the same length. Now you can see the old vise in action. Even though I don't need it to hold this block of wood, I thought I would put it in the vise anyway since it was already there. It came in handy anyway. Turns out I drilled the hole undersized and I had to make it bigger, and the block is a lot more stable when it's held in the vise. This next hole is for the lead screw, or actually the T-nut that gets driven in, and the prongs on the T-nut do a good job of holding it in. But to make sure that it stays in there and doesn't come loose, I'm going to use a screw to hold it in. Next, I can thread in the lead screw, and this is already made. I got this from one of my older homemade clamps that I took apart, but it's easy enough to make anyway. It's just a piece of 3/8 threaded rod with a handle on the end. To hold the nut on, you can use epoxy. I've done that before, and it works out well. But another way is to drill a hole through and put a pin in. And for the pin, I'm just using a small finish nail. Before I glue the retainer onto the moving jaw, I want to get a little bit of grease on the end of the lead screw where it rubs against the washer on the inside. While I'm waiting for the glue to dry on that, I can start putting the base together. And this is where that extra piece that I mentioned earlier would come in handy. It would have fit in the end perfectly, and I wouldn't have to cut out individual pieces. Next, I can get the fixed jaw glued in place and clamped. And then I can bring over the moving jaw assembly and glue that on as well. Except this time, instead of regular wood glue, I'm using epoxy. I want this joint to be extra strong. I gave the glue about an hour to dry, and now I'm going to fasten the guide to the bottom of the moving jaw. I'm just using screws for this, no glue. If this part starts to wear and loosen up, it's easy enough to replace. I'm also going to add screws up into the lead screw block to add a bit more strength to that joint. Tightening in the lead screw all the way, I can see that there's a small problem. I guess I got the wrong measurement somewhere because the jaws don't close together. It's easy enough to fix though. I just cut a thin block that makes up the difference, and I'll glue that onto the fixed jaw. Might notice the end sticking out there, that I didn't cut it off the right length. And the reason for that is that I have to cut these jaws anyway. They don't quite line up. That's mostly for looks though. It really doesn't affect the operation. So with that done, I got started on sanding it. But I wasn't happy with how the T-nut arrangement looked, so I cut a cover for it from hardwood and glued that on. I painted the original one yellow, mainly because I had yellow paint at the time, and the wood I used for that vise wasn't that good looking anyway, but I think I want to keep this one looking natural. So I covered the lead screw with masking tape, and I'm going to spray on 3 or 4 coats of clear finish. I've got to say I like the way this turned out. It's almost too pretty looking to use.